used to believe family was the safest place. Until the day they were the ones who pushed me in front of the judge's bench. The courtroom was silent to the point of suffocation. Across from me, my own parents, my ex-husband, and even my sister, all stood together on the same side. The sound of the gavel struck coldly, like a sentence meant for a stranger. I should have been protected by them. But after all those years, favoritism and contempt had turned family into a sweet trap, waiting for the day it would tighten around me. I still remember the moment Lila, my little daughter, clutched my hand as we left the birthday party. Her trembling voice whispered, "Mom." I heard them say, "They want to take you to court." Those words cut straight into my chest like a blade, heralding a storm I could no longer avoid. Before I tell you what really happened after that day and how I turned the tables and forced the whole family to bow their heads, leave me a comment letting me know where you started watching, and hit like if you also believe that sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dangerous traitors. I'm Elena, 34 years old. A single mother, recently divorced, working tirelessly to raise my 8-year-old daughter, Lila. I don't have much, a small rented apartment, an office job with just enough pay, and a long list of unpaid bills. But at least, I still have my daughter and the silver bracelet my mother left me, the two things that keep me standing through the storms. Tonight, I put on the simplest dress from my closet, smoothed down my hair, and held my daughter's hand as we headed to my sister Clara's birthday. The party was held at an upscale restaurant, crystal chandeliers sparkling, red wine swirling in glasses, everyone's smiles bright yet strained. From the moment I walked in, I felt like an outsider, lost among my own family. Clara walked over and gave me a half-hearted hug, her expensive perfume lingering in the air. "You made it," she said sweetly, though her eyes swept over the dress I was wearing with a hidden meaning. Moments later, a relative deliberately spoke loud enough for me to hear, divorced and still trying to dress up fancy. A few snickers followed, blending into the piano music playing in the corner. I stayed silent. Not because I didn't hear, but because I was too used to it. Used to the judging eyes, used to the veiled pity. Lila sat quietly beside me, her small hand clutching mine. Her eyes seemed to say, "Mom, I understand." The 3-tiered birthday cake was brought out. Candles flickered, everyone sang in unison to celebrate Clara. The golden light illuminated my sister's radiant face, while I stared at the smooth white frosting dusted with glittering sugar, so sweet it felt fake. The first spoonful touched my tongue, the cloying taste spreading through my mouth, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Just like this party, dazzling on the surface, bitter underneath. An uncle raised his glass toward me. "Elena, raising a child alone must be tough, isn't it? If only you had been a little more compromising, maybe you wouldn't have ended up divorced." His words rang out like a harmless toast, but to me, they cut like a cold blade. I set my glass down, my fingers damp with sweat. In my head, I wanted to scream, "You have no idea how many nights I stayed awake for my child, no idea how he abandoned us." But my lips stayed pressed shut. Only one whisper slipped out, "Silence doesn't mean I don't hear." I glanced at my daughter. Lila's eyes shimmered with deep sadness, no judgment, no ridicule, only empathy. I tried to smile at her, but my smile trembled. The clinking of glasses echoed around the table, laughter and chatter filling the air. Absent-mindedly, I reached for the silver bracelet on my wrist, searching for a trace of comfort in my mother's memory. Just then, Lila tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Mom." I heard them say, "They want to take you to court." My heart sank. The laughter, the music, the glowing candles around us, suddenly felt like a staged backdrop. I squeezed her hand, feeling the tremor in her tiny fingers. In that moment, I knew. The sneers, the condescending looks I had endured for years, were more than just small wounds. They were leading me into a bigger trap. A trap secretly laid by the very people I called family. But what they didn't know was that one day, that trap would snap back and bury them instead. After my daughter's whisper at the party, I immediately made up an excuse and left in a hurry. I didn't have the strength to stay even a minute longer, surrounded by those mocking stares ready to tear me apart. Sometimes, the truth comes from the trembling voice of a child. I held Lila's hand tightly, leading her out of that room drenched in lights and hollow laughter. Outside, the night wind cut into my skin. I opened the car door, and she climbed into the back seat, her small hands still clinging to mine. Her eyes were swollen, her lashes wet with tears. As the car moved, I tried to steady my grip on the wheel. On both sides of the road, the yellow lights stretched into blurry streaks. Inside, it was so quiet I could hear her shaky breathing. "Mom," Lila's voice cracked, heavy with sobs. "I heard Grandma and Grandpa. They said they'll take me back to Dad. They said you're too weak. The court won't believe you." Each word cut into my heart like a knife. My hand trembled on the steering wheel, and the car swayed to the side. I drew a deep breath and pulled it back into the lane, but my heart was still spinning out of control. "I don't want to go anywhere, Mom. I just want to be with you." Her voice broke into sobs, like a desperate plea. I bit my lip hard, my vision blurring with rising tears. In the rearview mirror, I saw Lila's wide, frightened eyes clinging to me as if I were the only rope keeping her from falling into an abyss. I reached one hand back and touched her small hand. "I promise you, Lila. I won't let anyone take you away. I'll fight until the very end." My voice was hoarse, but each word came out like a vow. In that moment, I understood that fear no longer belonged only to me. It had seeped into my daughter, the 8-year-old who should be protected, not turned into the messenger of the lies and schemes of adults. That night, the familiar road home felt endless. Every streak of light flashing across the window looked like a warning signal. I drove half in a trance, trying to comfort her while battling the panic swelling inside me. The silver bracelet from my mother felt icy cold around my wrist. I squeezed it without thinking, searching for something to hold on to, some fragile anchor. But then Lila's voice rose again, pulling me back. "If I have to leave you, who's going to tell me bedtime stories? Who's going to hold my hand on the way to school every morning?" I wanted to scream, to stop the car in the middle of the road and cry until my chest was empty. But I stayed silent, pressing my lips together to keep from breaking down. Because in that moment, I remembered myself once a trembling child, sitting in the dark, hearing whispers that I wasn't enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. Raindrops began tapping against the windshield. The water mixed with the yellow lights, smearing into hazy streaks, just like my eyes stinging and blurred. And in those streaks, I thought I saw another child. Not Lila this time, but me 10 years old, sitting in a corner, listening to my parents argue and decide my fate without ever asking what I wanted. The memory hit me hard, tightening my chest. Was this cycle repeating itself, passed down from one generation to the next? And this time, they were aiming at my daughter, the only heartbeat I truly had. I turned the fan higher, trying to clear the fog from the glass. But the reflection staring back was still Lila's eyes, shaking, terrified. I knew this moment wasn't just a warning. It was the beginning. If I didn't rise up, if I allowed things to go on as they always had, my daughter would be forced to endure the same fate I once carried. And I swore I would never let that happen. When the car stopped in front of our small apartment, I turned to her, brushing back the strands of hair stuck to her forehead with tears and sweat. "Listen to me, Lila. No matter what happens, you're never alone. We have each other." She nodded and buried her face into my shoulder, as if searching for the safest place in a collapsing world. In the darkness, the mocking laughter from the party still echoed in my head. But now, it wasn't just small scratches. It had become the sign of a real storm, and my daughter, with her trembling voice, had been the first to sound the alarm. After returning home, I stood still for a moment by the bed, watching Lila sleep peacefully under the soft yellow light. Her little hands still carried traces of tears but had folded into calmness. In that instant, my heart ached in a strange way. And suddenly, childhood memories came rushing back, as if I were looking at myself years ago, just as small, just as abandoned in a house that never truly felt safe. I remembered those early days, when the ticking of the wall clock echoed through our cramped home. My parents constantly compared me to Clara, my little sister who was always obedient, always praised. "Why can't you be as good as her?" That question repeated itself like a sentence handed down. Each time I heard it, I shrank back, tried harder, did more, but somehow it was never enough. Clara was the pride. I was only the shadow. The feeling of being weighed against her, diminished bit by bit, gnawed at me, making me believe my worth would always be less than someone else's. And so, from very early on, I learned to be silent. The sound of the clock in the living room reminded me that this silence was part of my fate. Hour after hour, day after day, I endured the judgment without ever daring to resist. And when I stepped into marriage, that vicious circle didn't stop. I thought I had escaped the comparisons, but no, I had only entered another prison, where the walls were built with threats and violence. The husband I once trusted turned into a controller. His smile in public was only a mask. At home, his anger without cause was the constant. I still remember that rainy night. Dinner sat cold on the table because he was late. I was just about to clear it away when the door slammed open. He walked in, reeking of alcohol, throwing his coat onto the chair. "Who told you to clear this before I ate?" His growl froze me in place. Then his rough hand overturned the entire tray, dishes shattering across the floor. All I could do was kneel down to pick up the pieces, trembling, trying not to let the tears spill out. There were times I heard his heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs. Each sound sent panic through me, my heart racing as if it might burst from my chest. I would hurriedly tug my sleeves down to hide the bruises that hadn't yet faded. Each mark on my skin was a signal, a warning that I was never allowed to talk back. Another time, Clara came by. She stood at the doorway, her eyes darkening when she saw me quickly pull my hand from my husband's grip, hiding the purple bruise on my wrist. But I forced a weak smile, lying that I had bumped into the table. She didn't ask more, but her gaze alone was enough to make me feel small and exposed. When someone gets used to silence, they think it's submission. That line echoed in my head, a bitter truth I had lived through too many times. The clock ticked again. I felt chained by each turn of the second hand. Every strike was an imprint, a reminder that I had to endure one more day. But then, in that memory, a pause appeared. The ticking stopped, and I saw Lila, her face in sleep rising up, replacing the image of the trembling child I once was. In that moment, I understood it was time to cut the cycle passed down from one generation to the next. Because if I kept silent, then my daughter would inherit the same fate, like a tape playing on an endless loop. The clock stopped completely, bringing me back to the present. I sat by the bed, clenched my hand tightly, and whispered a promise. This time, I would be silent no more. The next morning, as the thin sunlight slipped through the curtains, I was still sitting by Lila's bed, listening to her steady breathing as if it were the only thread keeping me from collapsing. The clock in the living room ticked away. This time, it wasn't counting hours of endurance, it was pounding a rhythm urging, "Enough, Elena." I put on my coat, grabbed a stack of messy papers, and rang Mark's doorbell. He opened the door with a knowing look. Without many questions, Mark poured tea, setting the cup carefully in front of me. I spoke. The shards of memories I thought I had buried spilled out, the slamming doors, shattered dinners, the bruises hidden under sleeves. Mark listened until the room held only the faint sound of a spoon touching porcelain. Then he spoke, his voice deep, deliberate, justice begins when you stop asking permission to exist. He pulled a small whiteboard closer, writing 3 words: plan, evidence, discipline. We'll need a detailed timeline, he explained. Date, time, location, what happened, who was present. Only facts, no adjectives. He handed me a slim black notebook, event journal. Each line must answer 4 questions: when, where, who, what? Add photos if possible. Don't write "I was scared." Write "He threw a bottle at the wall at 10:17 p.m. Lila was 2 meters away." Mark opened his briefcase and pulled out a numbered list, evidence checklist. Text messages/voicemails, screenshot full conversations with timestamps, export audio files, keep original file names. Photos and videos, unedited, preserve originals to retain metadata. Medical records, sign release forms, request copies of injury reports and therapy notes. Witnesses, neighbors, building managers, Lila's teachers/counselors. Write first-person statements, signed and dated, notarized if possible. Financial records, repair receipts, locksmith bills, expenses I paid on my own. And finally, Mark tapped his pen, backups, 1 copy in the cloud, 1 sealed USB, 1 kept at my office. Clear chain of custody. We started right at noon. In my living room, a large cloth spread on the floor, Mark and I knelt to sort, bruise photos arranged by date, hospital bills clipped together, voicemail files renamed with codes, EVO1_YYYYMMDD. Mark showed me how to export photos with EXIF intact, how to print screenshot details with timestamps. The court likes order, he said. The truth must be laid out so it can't be blurred. That afternoon, we went to the clinic. I filled out the HIPAA release, my hand trembling. The nurse softened when she heard Mark introduce himself. Please attach any notes on injuries as well, he said. We were told to collect the records by the end of the day. Walking out, Mark said, the hardest part isn't gathering evidence, it's keeping yourself anchored to the facts. They'll try to drag you into emotions. Next stop, the upstairs apartment. Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly neighbor, opened her door. She remembered that stormy night. I heard glass shattering and the little girl crying. Mark gently explained the witness statement format. Her hands shook as she wrote, but when she signed, she looked at me and said, "You're not alone." That was the first page in the witness section. We stopped by the building management office. Harlan dug through his computer and printed for Mark the noise complaint log from surrounding apartments matching the nights I had noted in my journal. The red seal stamped on the page stood out. This, Mark whispered, shatters the excuse of just a small argument. By late afternoon, we arrived at Lila's school. Ms. Reed, the school counselor, welcomed us into her office. I caught my breath as she read from her notes. Lila shows signs of anxiety, startles at loud noises, draws pictures of broken bottles. Mark asked for a copy of the counseling notes. She nodded, promising them by tomorrow. I gripped my bag strapped tightly to hold back tears. Back home, Mark spread everything across the table: photos, documents, statements, logs. He organized them into exhibits: E1 bruise photos, E2 hospital bills, E3 noise log, E4 Mrs. Alvarez's statement, E5 Ms. Reed's notes, E6 threatening voicemails. Tomorrow I'll file a motion for temporary custody protection of Lila, Mark said. Tonight, we practice testimony. He set up 2 chairs facing each other like a courtroom. I'm opposing counsel, Mark said, his eyes sharp. Are you an unstable mother? Didn't you ever yell at your husband? I took a breath. I raised my voice when he threw the bottle. Mark raised a hand, correct it. Facts, not excuses. I tried again. At 10:17 p.m. on September 12th, he threw a bottle at the wall. My daughter stood 2 meters away. I raised my voice to call her into her room. Mark nodded, good. Short, precise, no speculation. He taught me 3 rules. Look at the judge, not your ex-husband. Answer only the question asked. Stop when finished. If you don't remember, say, I don't recall exactly, never guess. And this one, Mark reminded, they'll ask why report now. I faltered. He helped, say the truth, because I was afraid. Because I thought enduring meant peace. Until my daughter paid the price. He softened, being hurt doesn't make you less credible. The journal and timestamps speak for you. Night fell. When Lila was asleep, I laid my mother's old divorce decree on the table. The ink had blurred, tears staining the paper like shadows. Beside it lay my new petition, crisp white, printed in bold. Mark placed the pen in my hand. My body trembled, but my eyes no longer wavered. I signed. The strokes were steady, firm, final. I'm not asking anymore. I'm claiming. I heard my own voice, low but clear, stitching my broken heart back together. Mark didn't pat my shoulder, didn't pour more tea. He simply gathered the documents, clipped them neatly, and showed me the case file label, Elena v. David, Child Custody and Protective Relief. Tomorrow, he said, I'll file this. Get some rest. Eat a real breakfast, drink water, and wear a plain long-sleeved shirt. No patterns, no lace. Let the truth be the only thing that draws attention. He paused at the door, and remember, don't text him, don't reply to provocations. All communication goes through lawyers. We keep the record clean. I nodded. The door closed, leaving the room bathed in the gentle light of evening, shining across the file in his hands. I could still see it glowing in my mind. The clock ticked again, but now its rhythm had changed, no longer a sentence, but a signal to move forward. I cleared the table. Each document into its folder, truth in E136, witness statements clipped, finances at the back. I placed the USB in a tin box along with my mother's silver bracelet. 2 small objects, one holding memory, one holding truth. I turned off the light. In the thin darkness, I knew I had crossed the line. As expected, just 2 weeks after the birthday party and my daughter's warning, I received a court summons. The petitioner was none other than my ex-husband. Together with my parents and my sister, they had made their move first, determined to turn me into the defendant. But this time, I wasn't running anymore. I was prepared. The courtroom lights glared down, the air thick as if every breath was being recorded. I sat on the defendant's bench, hands clasped tight, my eyes calm. Across from me, my family lined up, my father, my mother, Clara, and the man who used to be my husband. Every glance thrown at me was like a blade. My father was the first to rise. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. Elena has never been a responsible mother. Her daughter lacked care, was often neglected. His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes tried to hold authority. I saw Mark tilt his head and jot a few notes. When the judge asked for evidence, my father faltered. He only repeated, "We know, we saw it." But there were no documents, no witnesses beyond the nodding of his wife and daughter. My mother jumped up, tears streaming. She fabricated stories of abuse to smear this family. We raised her, gave her an education. Is this how she repays us? Each word was a dagger in my chest, but I only clenched my fists tighter, drew a long breath. Mark stood, his voice steady. Your Honor, the defendant has text messages showing that Clara once admitted to friends about concealing her brother-in-law's abuse. Permission to display. The screen lit up. Word by word, the messages appeared. Clara dropped her head, her hands trembling. Silence swept through the courtroom. Then my ex-husband rose. He wore a black suit, neat and polished, his eyes red as if worn from suffering. "I just want peace." She used to lash out, to hit me back. "I am the victim, Your Honor." He looked around, searching for pity, but Mark's eyes gleamed. "Permission to submit additional medical records," Mark said evenly. "X-ray scans, photos of injuries, and doctor's notes. These wounds could not be self-inflicted or from hitting back. This is systematic abuse." My ex-husband clenched his jaw, fists tightening. When the judge pressed him for specific dates, he stammered, evaded. His lies began to crack apart. My mother wept louder, desperate for sympathy. My father slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "You're fabricating this to destroy my family." But his voice was cut off by the cold rap of the gavel. "Order in the court." I remained still. Each time they lashed out, I only looked straight ahead, my heart storming, but my face unbroken. When it was my turn to speak, I rose. My voice carried through the microphone, steady and unshaken. "I was never perfect. But these wounds are real. And my daughter Lila deserves to grow up in truth, not inside a web of lies." I caught her eyes from the back row. Lila sat beside her guardian, wide-eyed, clutching her handkerchief. As I spoke, I saw her gaze brighten, as if a flame had been lit anew. Clara buried her face in her hands. My father stared down at the floor, unable to lift his head. My mother choked on her sobs, her voice breaking into the void. My ex-husband, the man who once screamed in my face, collapsed into his chair, his expression shattered, his eyes lost. The judge flipped through the files, voice firm. The plaintiff's accusations lack foundation. The defendant's evidence is clear, supported by witnesses and medical documentation. The court dismisses all claims against the defendant. The courtroom fell silent. The gavel struck, sharp and final, but to me, it was the sound of release. I closed my eyes, drew in a deep breath. For the first time in years, silence was no longer a prison, but an open space where I could breathe on my own terms. I was no longer a doll to be passed around. "I'm not asking anymore," I whispered inside. "I'm taking back what's mine." Afternoon light streamed through the windows, glinting on the files in Mark's hands. I turned and caught the faint smile at the corner of his lips, not the smile of a victor, but of someone who had just witnessed a soul step out of the dark. After the evidence was fully presented, it was clear my ex-husband had lost every advantage. He sat in silence, his bloodshot eyes fixed on me with hatred, his fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white against the wooden table. And then the judge's gavel struck firm, decisive, leaving no room for reversal. The verdict was declared. I was granted full custody of Lila. He was ordered to pay monthly support. In that very moment, I caught his gaze, hollow yet burning with resentment, as if I had just stripped him of the only weapon he had left. He let out a bitter, forced laugh, but it trembled with helplessness. No more lies, no more cries of false victimhood. Only venomous silence remained. From the seats nearby, Mark gave a slight nod. His eyes were steady as he quietly placed one hand on the thick stack of files, reminding me that every ounce of effort had been defended to the end. A faint smile flickered across his face, not the loud joy of victory, but a recognition Elena had climbed a mountain. My parents approached, their faces torn with conflict. My mother's hand trembled as she gripped my sleeve, her eyes brimming with tears. "Elena, we're still family. Please forgive me." My father lowered his head, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong. But are you really going to abandon us forever?" I stayed silent for a moment, my fingers brushing against the silver bracelet on my wrist. The glint of metal caught the courtroom lights, reminding me of the hand that once shielded me when I was a child. I lifted my head, my voice steady at last. Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the door. I can't return to a place that abandoned me. My mother broke into sobs, my father stood frozen, and my ex-husband suddenly shot up, ready to argue, but the judge's gavel silenced him with a sharp warning. Mark glanced at him, his eyes cold, as if to remind him that this time, the law stood with the truth. I walked out of the courthouse. The heavy doors closed behind me, and the autumn sky poured down golden light. I drew in a deep breath. The air outside was cold yet sweet, like breathing for the first time with lungs of my own. Lila rushed into my arms, wrapping her tiny arms tightly around my waist. I bent down, her hair carrying the scent of sunshine, the silver bracelet glimmering again no longer under the harsh light of the court, but in the glow of freedom. This victory wasn't as sweet as I once imagined. It carried bitterness, the taste of loss, of burying the family that shared my blood. But within that bitterness, I felt the sprout of something new. I held Lila's hand, her small fingers intertwined firmly with mine. Every step we took down the courthouse steps was not just a step into the light, it was a step away from the past, opening a new chapter of life. After the trial, Lila and I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't luxurious old walls, scratched wooden floors, drafty windows. But in our eyes, it was a beginning. I remember the moment I put the key in the lock and opened the door for the first time. The smell of old paint mixed with wood dust rushed in, and Lila ran around every room, her eyes glowing. "Mom, is this really our home?" I nodded. My heart suddenly felt lighter. No more cold walls filled with shouting. This was a space just for the two of us, and we would turn it into a place filled with laughter. In the first days, we were busy with little things. We painted the living room walls together pastel green, the color Lila chose. She fumbled with a roller covered in paint, her tiny hands creating clumsy strokes full of excitement. I laughed, then picked up a brush myself, each stroke wiping away another layer of the past. As the wall grew brighter, so did her face. We bought a few bunches of flowers at the market. Lila chose yellow daisies, I picked some lavender. We put them in a glass jar and set it on the tiny dining table. The flowers leaned toward the sunlight, just like tender hearts finding their way to the light. Laughter began to replace the heavy silence that once smothered the old house. Lila laughed when she saw paint on my nose, I laughed when she sang little songs she learned at school. Those simple sounds, to me, were more precious than any melody. Mark stopped by sometimes. He helped us move boxes, carried stacks of books, set up shelves. One day, he surprised us with a green plant, placing it right by the sunlit window. Every home needs a fresh start. I looked at his hand resting on the pot, strong yet patient. Lila squealed, watering it too much until the floor was soaked. We all laughed, and the room echoed with something it had never held before, real laughter. At night, when Lila was asleep, the small apartment fell quiet. I made tea, while Mark sat by the desk. The soft yellow lamp lit up a photo of his late wife. I caught the moment he folded the picture, his motion slow, his eyes both tender and sad. Two shadows on the wall, his and mine, met in the quiet light. We didn't say much. No one tried to rescue anyone. We were just two people choosing to walk side by side, quietly setting down old pain. Another night, while we sat on the balcony under the moon, Mark suddenly said softly, "We don't need to be perfect to deserve love." I went still. That sentence touched the deepest crack inside me. For so long, I believed I was broken, stripped of all worth after years of violence. But his eyes didn't see me as damaged. He looked at me like an ordinary person, worthy of happiness. I smiled for the first time in years, a smile that wasn't forced. The potted plant by the window slowly became its own symbol. Every morning, when I pulled the curtain and saw the green leaves trembling in the sun, I knew my heart was being reborn too. Every time Lila ran to Mark, proudly telling him the plant had grown taller. I heard trust in her voice. She believed this home would be safe, and that her mother would never abandon her the way others once abandoned me. I began journaling again. The pen glided across the page without trembling anymore. The words no longer spoke of fear, but of small joys: the scent of daisies in the kitchen, my daughter's laughter in her sleep, Mark's quiet presence on the balcony. I wrote about a new life, not perfect, but real. And each line was proof that I was living, not just surviving. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about walking out of the courtroom. It was in the first breath when I knew I no longer feared the dark. It was in the moment I dared to open my heart again, letting someone step inside, not to replace, not to rescue, but to build a home together. And when I closed my journal one late autumn night, the lamp casting light over the last words, I knew I had truly stepped into freedom. A freedom not loud, not hurried, but quiet enough for a heart to dare to believe again. Night fell, and Elena sat beside the bed, quietly watching Lila sleep. The little girl's steady breaths, like a lullaby, carried a gentle reminder every choice she made was for her child. She whispered, as if carving a vow into her own heart, "You will grow up knowing that I chose you, not silence." The silver bracelet gleamed under the nightlight. Once, it had been an invisible shackle, reminding her of the darkness. But now, every time she looked down at her wrist, Elena saw herself stepping out, reborn. What was once evidence of pain had turned into a symbol of strength. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, spilling gold across the green wall. Elena flung the door wide open and drew in a long breath. She realized happiness didn't come from judgment or being right, but from the moment the heart dared to believe again. No need for perfection, no need to prove anything, just a home where laughter filled the empty spaces, where she and her daughter could finally breathe in freedom. Elena opened her journal and wrote the final line, "I am no longer just existing. I am living. And I have chosen love." Closing it, she smiled. A new life had truly begun. And perhaps you, the one listening to this story, have also felt what it's like to be pushed into silence. Remember, silence is never the answer. Share this story so someone out there knows they are not alone. If you feel this journey touched you, don't forget to hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel. It's a small but meaningful way for us to keep spreading stories of courage and healing.